The 14th Sunday in Ordinary Time for Year C gives us another example of a passage that's unique to Luke's Gospel. In other words, if we didn't have the Gospel of Luke, we wouldn't know about the existence of this mysterious group of 70 disciples that Jesus appoints and then sends out on a mission to proclaim the kingdom of God. It's something that's only here in the Gospel of Luke. It's a really, really important passage. So today we're going to look at Luke chapter 10, verse 1 through 12, and then 17 through 20. And this is the mission of the 70, or in some translations, 72, and we'll get into that, these 72 disciples. Who are they? What do they mean? What are they appointed for? And what do they mean for us today as we look at the church? So let's just read through the text and then we'll unpack it together in light of its Old Testament background. After this, the Lord appointed 70, or in some manuscripts, 72 others, and sent them on ahead of him, 2 by 2, into every town and place where he himself was about to come. And he said to them, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Pray therefore the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. Go your way. Behold, I send you out as lambs in the midst of wolves. Carry no purse, no bag, no sandals, and salute no one on the road. Whatever house you enter, first say, 'Peace be to this house.' If a son of peace is there, your peace shall rest upon him. But if not, it shall return to you. And remain in the same house, eating and drinking what they provide, for the laborer deserves his wages. Do not go from house to house. Whenever you enter a town and they receive you, eat what is set before you. Heal the sick in it and say to them, 'The kingdom of God has come near to you.' But whenever you enter a town and they do not receive you, go into its streets and say, 'Even the dust of your town that clings to our feet, we wipe off against you. Nevertheless, know this, that the kingdom of God has come near. I tell you, it shall be more tolerable on that day for Sodom than for that town." Now it skips down to verse 17, and it says this, "The 70, or 72 in some translations, returned with joy, saying, 'Lord, even the demons are subject to us in your name.' And he said to them, 'I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Behold, I have given you authority to tread upon serpents and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall hurt you. Nevertheless, do not rejoice in this, the spirits are subject to you, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven." Okay, a lot going on here in this passage. The first thing I would say about it is that if you're familiar with the mission discourse of the 12 apostles, so for example in Matthew chapter 10, when Jesus sends out the 12 and tells them to cure the sick and to cast out demons and to preach about the kingdom of God, and that he's sending them out as lambs in the midst of wolves, you're going to notice a lot of parallels, okay? So the mission of the 70 and the mission of the 12 parallel one another. They clearly have the same kind of apostolic and evangelistic function and mission that the earlier mission of the apostles has. Jesus is giving them the authority to cast out demons and proclaim the coming of the kingdom of God as he sends them out 2 by 2 into the various towns and cities surrounding them. So that's the first point. This is a similar mission discourse to that of the 12. However, obviously there's a big difference, which is that it's not the 12, but this group of the 70, which only Luke tells us about. Now, as soon as I say the 70, you get into the question of, is it 70 or 72? Now, the Revised Standard Version here has 70, and then in a footnote, it has other ancient manuscripts read 72. And the New American Bible says 72. And so you might be wondering, well, wait, how many disciples is it? And the answer is, we don't know. This is one of those discrepancies in what scholars call text criticism. It's the comparison of ancient manuscripts. And when there are discrepancies in ancient manuscripts, at some point an error crept in where one scribe wrote one thing and another scribe wrote another thing, and there's a discrepancy between the various copies of the New Testament that we have from antiquity. Now this one is actually not a very big deal. It's pretty easily explained if you know your Old Testament, okay? So, a couple of points here. First, there are very reliable ancient Greek manuscripts that have the number 70 here. So Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Alexandrinus. These are two ancient copies of the New Testament in Greek that are considered very reliable, very authoritative from the 4th century AD. They have 70. Other copies of Luke, like Papyrus 75 or Codex Vaticanus, have 72. So the ancient manuscript evidence is kind of equally divided. And so, as you might expect, scholars are equally divided about which one's more original. In this case, though, I don't think we actually have to decide on the original, although I have my opinions, because they mean basically the same thing, if you know the Old Testament background. Because in the Old Testament, the number 70 has a significance that's tied to the priestly elders that Moses appoints during the time of the Exodus. So you might recall in Exodus chapter 24, when Moses is establishing the Old Covenant, he chooses 70 elders, the Greek word there is presbyteros, to act as basically mediators, priestly mediators between God and the 12 tribes of Israel. And they come up the mountain of Sinai with Moses to offer sacrifice on behalf of the people of Israel. And these 70 elders, later on in the book of Numbers in chapter 11, verse 16 through 30, Moses takes these 70 elders and he appoints them to help him administrate and govern this massive number of people as they're traveling through the desert. You might remember in the book of Numbers chapter 11, Moses is basically like up to his neck in administration, and he can't possibly do all the work that it entails. And his father-in-law Jethro says, well, appoint 70 men to assist you, right, to govern the 12 tribes of Israel. And when he does this, this is important, the Spirit comes down upon the 70 elders, and they're anointed to lead the people of Israel. They are with Moses at the tabernacle. But what happens is 2 other men outside the camp, their names are Eldad and Medad, neither one of those very popular names in later Christian tradition, also receive the Spirit, even though they're outside of the confines of the group that Moses has gathered. And so what happens is, from the book of Numbers, an ambivalence or an ambiguity arises. How many elders were there? How many priestly elders were there at the time of the Exodus? Well, you could make the case that it was 70 on the basis of Mount Sinai, but you could also make the case that there were 72 elders on the basis of the book of Numbers. Both are true, right? What matters, though, is that in both cases, the 70 or 72 represent a priestly hierarchy of appointed leaders underneath Moses and then the 12 phylarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay, so 70 is a number that's significant for the elders of Israel. But it gets even better, because 70 and 72 are also symbolic in another place in the Old Testament. In the book of Genesis, not a lot of people know this, but it's important. In the book of Genesis chapter 11, if there's this long table or genealogy of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, where it goes through all the nations that are descended from Shem and Ham and Japheth. And most of modern people just skip over it because, it's boring because we don't care about genealogy. In the ancient world, they didn't skip over it. They actually read it very carefully. It was called the Table of Nations. And it was seen as a catalog of where all the different peoples in the world came from. And what's fascinating is that if you look at the Hebrew copies of Genesis 11 and you count up the names of the nations, guess how many nations there are? 70 nations. Now, in the Greek Septuagint, it was translated a little differently. And if you look at those copies, guess how many Gentile nations there are? 72, right? So a tradition arose that the number 70 or 72 represented the number of Gentile nations, the number of peoples that there were, so to speak, in the world. And so some traditions within Judaism would see the world in terms of 12 tribes of Israel and 70 or 72 Gentile nations. By the way, just while I'm at it, this is also what's behind the Septuagint. Why do we call the Septuagint the Septuagint? Well, because of a Jewish tradition that 70 Jewish translators went to Egypt and translated the Bible into Greek, the language of who? The nations, right? The Gentile nations. So the 70 is the translation of the Jewish scriptures that can be read by the nations of the world. And it's not just a coincidence that it's 70 elders. While I'm at it, I might as well throw this in too. Guess how many members of the Sanhedrin there were in Jerusalem? 70. Okay? So 70 has a number of symbolic layers of meaning that are associated with it from the Old Testament. So, if you're Jesus, and it's the 1st century AD, and people are saying you're the Messiah, and you gather not just a group of 12 around you, but also you appoint 70 other disciples around you, what are you doing? What are you saying? What's the implication of that act? Well, it's not just that you're the new Moses and there's a new Exodus, but something much more. You are setting up a priestly hierarchy of appointed leaders underneath you, not just to bring the good news to the 12 tribes of Israel, but to bring the good news to all the nations. So it's an implicit act of claim of authority on Jesus' part. It's an implicit establishment of a priestly hierarchy on Jesus' part. And it's also an anticipation of the fact that the gospel is going to go not just to the 12 tribes of Israel, but to all the nations of the world. And if you might have missed that connotation of the 70, I bet the 70 members of the Sanhedrin when Jesus was alive didn't miss the point. They would have gotten the point. Because at the head of the 70 members of the Sanhedrin was the one high priest. So it was 70 plus one, the high priest. And Jesus isn't a member of the 70 or the 12. He's above them. So he's making himself like a new high priest. So if you look on one of the handouts that I have for the Master Readings Explained, it's basically a hierarchy that's based on the Old Testament. So in the Old Testament you had Moses, and then next to him you had Aaron, and then you had Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, the 3 who go up the mountain with Moses, and then you had the 12 tribes and the 70 elders. So 1, 3, 12, 70. Moses, Aaron and his 2 sons, the 3, the 12 tribes, and then the 70 elders. Jesus, in the New Testament, what does he do? He's at the top. Jesus is number 1. Peter is above the 12, but he's a member of the 12. Then you have the 3, Peter, James, and John, just like Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu. Then you have the 12 apostles. And then only Luke tells us that there's a 5th group, and it's the 70 disciples. Now, is that a coincidence? Did Jesus know that he was setting up a hierarchy of priestly groups with symbolic numbers that echo the Exodus from Egypt? I think so. I don't think that's a coincidence. But it's fascinating because when people think about Jesus, I can't tell you how many times I've read this in books, well, Jesus didn't establish a priesthood. He didn't establish a ministerial priesthood. He just had groups of followers and disciples, and they all kind of, bandied about the countryside, that there was no organization to it. Nothing could be further from the truth. You would only think that if you're ignorant of the Old Testament. Any 1st century Jew who knows the scriptures knows that if this guy is walking around Judea and he's got himself at the top, he's got these 3 guys that are intimate with him, he's got 12, and then he adds 70 to it, everyone knows what he's doing here. He's setting up a new priesthood. He's setting up a new hierarchy of consecrated men to rule over a new Israel in which he himself acts not just as king, but as the high priest. So the 70 are extremely important because they reveal this implicit hierarchy of Jesus' disciples, which is going to constitute a new priesthood that's centered not on the Jerusalem temple, but on Jesus himself. Not on the sons of Aaron, but on the apostles and the appointed disciples of Jesus.